There is a version of this job that the public understands. The ranger who answers questions at the visitor center. The one who checks permits at the trailhead. The one who gives the talks about local wildlife on Saturday mornings. That version is real. But there is another version. The version that happens at 2 a.m. on a trail that isn't on any public map, 20 miles from the nearest paved road, in terrain where your radio has a 40% chance of not reaching anyone. That version has a different set of rules, and a different set of things that can happen to you. The 10 accounts tonight come from people who worked that version of the job, who went out alone into the dark and found something that the morning shift never had to deal with, who came back and sat down at a desk and stared at the incident report form for a very long time, because there was no box on that form for what they had seen. Tonight, we cover what they found, and what they did, and didn't, put in the report. If you enjoy supernatural stories, consider subscribing. New stories are published regularly. Before we get into the cases, I want to give you a sense of what the job actually looks like at night. Because the daytime version, the visitor center, the permit checks, the Saturday wildlife talks, is genuinely not what we're talking about. The National Park Service manages 85 million acres of land across the United States. Of those 85 million acres, the vast majority have no cell coverage, no surveillance infrastructure, no emergency services within reach. When a ranger goes out on a night patrol in a backcountry section of a major park, Yosemite, the Smokies, Glacier, the Olympic Peninsula, they are operating in an environment where the nearest backup is, at minimum, an hour away, often more. They are trained for this. They carry weapons, emergency equipment, and communication devices designed specifically for remote deployment. They know the terrain. Many of them have patrolled the same sections for years and can read the forest the way a reader reads a familiar book. They know what belongs there and what doesn't. This is important, because when a ranger with 10 or 15 years of backcountry experience says they encountered something they couldn't identify or explain, that statement carries a weight that a first-time hiker's account simply doesn't have. These are not people who are easily spooked. These are not people who mistake shadows for something else. They are professionals trained to observe accurately and report precisely, and several of them, across different parks, different years, different sections of terrain, have reported the same thing. Something in the forest at night that their training, their equipment, and their experience gave them no framework to address. Something that made them question not just what they had seen, but what the forest they had worked in for years actually contained. That is where tonight's accounts begin. There is a body of research that sits at the intersection of what rangers experience and what the official record acknowledges. And that intersection is smaller than it should be. David Paulides is a former police detective who spent over a decade documenting what he calls missing 411 cases. Disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas that share specific anomalous characteristics. No tracks, search dogs that lose the scent abruptly at a specific point. Bodies found miles from where the person was last seen, in terrain they could not have crossed under their own power. Children found in locations that search teams with full equipment had already searched. Clothing removed in freezing temperatures with no signs of hypothermia affecting the decision-making. Paulides has documented hundreds of these cases. He has also documented something else, something that is less discussed in the public conversation about his research, but that is deeply relevant to tonight's accounts. He has documented the pattern of ranger behavior around these cases. Specifically, the reluctance to provide information through standard channels, the unusual speed with which certain files are closed, the number of NPS rangers who have told him, off the record, that what they found at certain scenes was not consistent with what the official report described. Not because they were lying in the official report, but because there was no language in the official report for what they had actually found. Several of the accounts tonight were brought to our attention through researchers connected to Paulides' network. Several of the rangers who spoke to us had previously spoken to Paulides. None of them told him the full story either. Tonight, for the first time, some of them are. Before we get into the specific accounts, there is one more layer of context that matters. And it is the layer that the official investigation framework consistently ignores. Every major national park in the United States sits on land that was inhabited by indigenous people for thousands of years before European contact. The Cherokee in the Smokies, the Ute in the area surrounding Skinwalker Ranch and the Uinta Basin, the Hoh and Quileute on the Olympic Peninsula, the Blackfeet adjacent to Glacier, the Miwok and Ahwahneechee in Yosemite. These peoples did not live on this land without knowing it intimately. They knew every ridge, every drainage, every section of terrain that produced reliable food, and every section that didn't. And they knew, in a way that has been documented by anthropologists, ethnographers, and oral historians for over a century, which locations on that land were to be avoided. Not because of terrain hazards, not because of predators, because of something else. Something that the Western scientific framework that the National Park Service operates within has no category for. Several of the locations where tonight's accounts take place correspond precisely to areas that the indigenous peoples of those regions identified as dangerous for reasons that were never geological, meteorological, or ecological. The rangers who work those areas today were not told this when they were hired. Most of them found out later, usually after their own encounter, when they started asking questions and someone who knew the land longer than the park had existed told them what had always been known about that specific piece of ground. We are not going to tell you that indigenous tradition explains what these rangers encountered. We are going to tell you that the tradition and the modern accounts point at the same locations. And that is not a coincidence we are prepared to dismiss. Our first case is the most documented of the 10 on tonight's list, and the one that established for us the standard of evidence we would apply to all the others. It involves a 14-year veteran of the National Park Service, a ranger stationed at the Grand Canyon's north rim, the remote side of the canyon, the side that closes entirely in winter, the side that sees a fraction of the visitors that the south rim receives. The north rim, in February, is as isolated as any location within the continental United States. The road in from Jacob Lake is 44 miles of two-lane highway through the Kaibab Plateau. The nearest town of any size is Kanab, Utah, over an hour away under ideal conditions. In February, conditions are rarely ideal. The ranger, we will call him Officer M, which is how he identified himself to us through the researcher who connected us, had worked the North Rim for 6 of his 14 years with the NPS. He knew the terrain the way you know the inside of your own home. He had patrolled the same corridors hundreds of times. He had conducted search and rescue operations in that canyon. He had spent nights alone in sections of the North Rim that most people never see. He was not someone who startled easily. He was not someone who used language imprecisely. When he described what happened during a routine patrol on the night of February 14th, 2023, he chose his words with the care of someone who knew exactly how they would sound and had decided to say them anyway. The patrol was flagged as a priority for a specific reason that Officer M described as unusual but not unprecedented. The mule deer population in a specific corridor of the North Rim had been demonstrating avoidance behavior. Not unusual avoidance. Deer avoid predator zones routinely. This was different. The avoidance was total across the entire deer population that used that corridor, and it had persisted for 6 weeks without any identified cause. No predator activity in the area. No environmental hazard. No geological event. The deer simply refused to use a section of trail they had used consistently for the 3 years that Officer M had been monitoring them. Wildlife behavior anomalies of this kind are documented in the research literature as potential indicators of seismic activity, subsurface gas releases, or other environmental changes. Officer M had investigated all of these possibilities and ruled them out. He went in on the night of February 14th specifically to observe the corridor on foot at night, to see if there was anything visible after dark that might explain the deer behavior. He carried his standard body camera, which he activated at the trailhead, and his personal phone as a secondary recording device. He also carried a personal audio recorder, which he had purchased and brought without it being part of his standard equipment, because he had a feeling, he said, that audio documentation might be important. He would later describe that feeling as the most significant instinct he had ever acted on in 14 years of field work. The body camera footage covers 4 hours and 12 minutes. For the first 2 hours and 47 minutes, it is completely routine. Trail condition documentation, weather observation, standard logging of landmarks and waypoints. Officer M's voice is calm and professional throughout. At the 2:47:13 mark, Officer M stops mid-sentence during a trail condition note. He pauses for approximately 4 seconds. Then he says, quietly but clearly, "There's something wrong with the sound." At that precise moment, 2:47:13, the audio on the body camera cuts out. Not gradually. Not with the kind of degradation you get from signal interference or battery issues. It cuts, like a switch being thrown. The visual continues to record. Officer M continues to move, continues to scan his environment, continues to react to things, turning his head, adjusting his pace, stopping, looking in specific directions. He is clearly still hearing something. His body language over the next 19 minutes is that of someone processing auditory information that his camera is not capturing. At the 3:06:44 mark, Officer M stops. He is facing a specific section of canyon wall. He does not move for 11 minutes and 38 seconds. The body camera records him standing still, facing the wall for the entire duration. His eyes are open. He is not frozen in the way that shock produces freezing. His eyes move, he breathes, he occasionally adjusts his weight. He looks like someone who is listening, deeply, completely listening to something that requires total concentration. At 3:18:22, he begins walking, in the wrong direction, away from the trailhead, deeper into the corridor. He walks approximately 200 yards before he stops, stands still for about 20 seconds, and then turns and walks in the correct direction, back toward the trailhead. He does not appear to be aware that he had been walking the wrong way. The audio resumes at 3:19:44, exactly 32 minutes and 31 seconds after it cut out. The first thing Officer M says when the audio returns is not a trail condition note. It is a single sentence spoken quietly. "I need to think about whether I write this down." He returns to the trailhead. He drives back to the ranger station. He files his incident report. The incident report, which we obtained a copy of through a researcher who reviewed it before it was classified, described the patrol as routine with no notable incidents. The audio cutout was attributed to equipment malfunction. The 11-minute stationary period was not mentioned. The wrong direction walk was not mentioned. Officer M signed the report and submitted it. The report was reviewed by his supervisor the following morning and classified as law enforcement sensitive under NPS internal policy, a classification that removes it from standard FOIA access. We filed a Freedom of Information Act request anyway. The request was denied in full. Not partially, not with redactions, in full. We appealed the denial through the standard administrative process. The appeal was denied at the first level of review. We submitted a second appeal. We are still waiting. What we have instead of the full report is the testimony of Officer M himself, given through an intermediary researcher in a recorded conversation that we cannot publish directly, but whose contents we have been authorized to describe, and the testimony of the ranger who debriefed him the following morning, a colleague of 15 years who agreed to speak with us on background, meaning without attribution. That colleague's statement, given to us verbatim, he said he heard something that made language sound wrong, not loud, not frightening in the way a threat is frightening, wrong. Like hearing a word you know in a context that makes it mean something it shouldn't mean. He said it lasted the entire time he was standing at the wall, and he said, and this is the part that I've thought about every day since he told me, he said he understood it. Not the content, not what it was saying, but the fact that it was communication. He said whatever was producing that sound was communicating. And he said he understood, in a way he couldn't explain and still can't explain, that it was communicating with him specifically, that it knew he was there, and that it had been waiting for him to come close enough to hear it. Officer M requested a transfer to a different NPS district 3 weeks after the incident. The transfer was approved without question. He has not returned to the North Rim. He has not spoken publicly about what happened. The mule deer, according to a colleague who still works that corridor, returned to using the section of trail they had been avoiding approximately 10 days after Officer M's patrol. Whatever had been keeping them out of that section of the North Rim, it was no longer there when they came back, or it had moved to somewhere else. We don't know which. The canyon doesn't say. Our second case takes us to the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. The same dense, ancient, old-growth forest that appears repeatedly in documented missing persons cases in the Pacific Northwest, and that we have covered on this channel before in connection with cases that have never been resolved. The Olympic Peninsula is one of the most ecologically isolated regions in the contiguous United States. The Hoh Rainforest, which sits in the heart of the Olympic National Forest, receives up to 14 feet of rain per year, making it one of the wettest temperate rainforests on Earth. The Douglas fir and Sitka spruce in the Hoh grow to heights of 300 feet, creating a canopy so dense that the forest floor exists in a permanent twilight even at midday. GPS signals are unreliable under that canopy. Radio communications are inconsistent. Cell coverage non-existent past the first few miles of established trail. When a ranger goes into the Hoh backcountry for a patrol, they go in knowing that for the duration of that patrol, they are effectively alone in a way that very few environments on Earth produce. This is the context for the account of Ranger Station 7, a remote patrol cabin in the backcountry of the Olympic National Forest. that was used intermittently by NPS rangers during extended patrol assignments in the late 1990s. The cabin has since been decommissioned, taken off the patrol rotation in 2003 for reasons that the NPS described in internal communications as maintenance and safety concerns, but that several former rangers who used the cabin described when interviewed by a researcher named James Hartley for a 2001 paper on backcountry operations as something else entirely. Ranger Thomas Weyrich had been with the Olympic National Forest Ranger Division for 11 years when he was assigned to a 5-day solo patrol using Ranger Station 7 as his base in October of 1997. He had used the cabin before, twice on previous assignments, without incident. The first 3 days of the 1997 assignment were unremarkable. Standard backcountry patrol, trail condition assessment, wildlife monitoring. The area around the cabin was quiet in the way that old-growth forest is quiet. A deep, layered, textured silence full of bird calls and wind through the canopy and the distant sound of the Hoh River. Weyrich knew that silence well. He had spent enough nights in that forest to be able to read it the way a sailor reads the sea, to distinguish between the normal quiet of a calm night and the specific, heavier silence that means something large is nearby. On the fourth night, at approximately 11:30 p.m., the heavier silence arrived. Weyrich was inside the cabin, writing his daily log, when the ambient sound of the forest outside, the insects, the owls, the occasional movement of deer, stopped. Completely. In his account to Hartley, he described the silence as happening all at once, not gradually. One moment the forest was alive with its normal nocturnal sounds. The next moment it was completely silent. He had experienced this before. The sudden quiet that precedes a predator moving through an area. It typically lasted 2 or 3 minutes, and was followed by a gradual return of the ambient sounds as the wildlife recalibrated. This silence lasted 47 minutes. He timed it. He was too experienced to go outside immediately. A ranger who goes outside into total forest silence at 11:30 p.m. without knowing what caused it is a ranger making a potentially serious mistake. He stayed inside, with the cabin door locked and his sidearm accessible, and he waited. At the 47-minute mark, something approached the cabin. Not quietly. It approached with sounds that Weyrich described as deliberate. Heavy footfalls on the wet forest floor. A rhythm that was bipedal. 2 feet, not 4, but with a stride length that he estimated, based on the interval between footfalls, as significantly longer than any human stride. The footsteps circled the cabin. Once, at a consistent distance of approximately 15 feet from the exterior walls. The circuit took approximately 4 minutes. Then the footsteps stopped, directly outside the door. For approximately 3 minutes, nothing happened. Weyrich sat inside with his hand on his sidearm, watching the door, listening. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from the door back into the forest, diminishing in volume as they went. After approximately 2 minutes, they were gone. The forest sounds returned approximately 20 minutes after the footsteps departed. Not all at once, gradually, tentatively, in the way that wildlife returns to an area after a significant predator has moved on. Weyrich did not sleep that night. At first light, he went outside to examine the perimeter of the cabin. What he found is the element of this case that researcher James Hartley described as the most significant piece of physical evidence he had encountered in years of documenting ranger accounts. In the wet soil around the cabin, soil that, after 14 feet of annual rainfall, maintains impressions as precisely as fresh concrete. There were no tracks. Not reduced tracks. Not partial tracks. No tracks. The forest floor around the cabin, which should have recorded every footfall with perfect clarity in that saturated soil, showed no evidence that anything had walked there. The footsteps Weyrich had clearly heard, that he had timed, that he had tracked with his ears as they circled the cabin and stopped at the door, had left no physical record whatsoever. Weyrich spent the fifth and final day of his assignment completing his patrol, filed his standard incident report describing no notable occurrences, and requested upon his return that he not be assigned to Ranger Station 7 again. The request was granted. He was never asked to explain it. He told Hartley in 2001 that he had described the incident to one other ranger, a colleague he trusted, who told him that two rangers who had used the same cabin in 1994 had filed similar informal reports of sounds at night that left no tracks. Those informal reports, if they ever existed as written documents, have not been located. Weyrich retired from the NPS in 2009. In the interview with Hartley, he said something that has stayed with us since we first read the 2001 paper. He said, "The thing that bothers me most is not what I heard. What bothers me most is the absence of evidence that I heard it. Because something that can produce sound without producing physical trace is operating by rules I don't have access to. And something operating by rules I don't have access to, in terrain I work in alone, is a problem I have no solution for." Ranger Station 7 was officially decommissioned in 2003. The NPS cited aging infrastructure. Several former rangers who knew the cabin said the real reason was that nobody would agree to use it anymore. The cabin itself was dismantled in 2005. The site has been returned to natural growth. If you went there today, you would not know the cabin had ever existed. The forest has taken the site back completely. Whatever circled it on that October night in 1997 is still out there, in a forest that is still open, that people hike through every day, who have no idea what Thomas Weyrich heard from inside that cabin, or what left no trace in the mud outside the door. Our third case comes from Arkansas, specifically from the Ouachita National Forest, which covers approximately 1.8 million acres across Arkansas and Oklahoma, and represents one of the largest national forests in the southern United States. The Ouachita is old forest. Some of its shortleaf pine stands are over 200 years old, and it is isolated in the specific way that southern forests are isolated, not by terrain difficulty, but by sheer acreage and the relative absence of through routes that bring regular human traffic. There are sections of the Ouachita that receive almost no recreational use. Sections where the only regular human presence is the NPS and Forest Service personnel who patrol them. The ranger at the center of this case, we will call him Officer D, which is how he is identified in the research documentation we worked from, had 11 years of experience with the Ouachita National Forest at the time of his encounter. He had worked the night patrol rotation for 6 of those 11 years. He was, by all accounts of colleagues who knew him, among the most methodical and analytically minded people in his unit. Not someone given to interpretation, someone given to observation. What he observed on October 9, 2021, during a routine night patrol on a section of Forest Road in the central Ouachita, he submitted to researcher Jody Cook, who has spent years documenting dogman and bipedal creature accounts from the southern United States, in a detailed written statement that Cook shared with us in full, with Officer D's permission. The encounter began at 11:47 p.m. Officer D was driving his patrol vehicle at approximately 35 miles per hour on a gravel forest road when something crossed the road in his headlights. It crossed from right to left, moving from dense brush on the right shoulder to dense brush on the left shoulder. The crossing took, and Officer D emphasized this in his written statement, noting that he had replayed it mentally hundreds of times and was confident in the estimate. Approximately 2 seconds. The road at that point is approximately 18 feet wide. The crossing covered that 18 feet in approximately 2 seconds at what Officer D estimated was a moderate walking pace. He was not running. The creature, and Officer D uses that word specifically in his statement, noting that he chose it deliberately after considering and rejecting animal and person, was bipedal, completely upright, moving with a bipedal gait that Officer D described as natural, not the awkward compensatory uprightness of a bear walking on its hind legs, which he had observed multiple times in his career, and which he said was unmistakably different. This was an animal, or something, for which bipedal movement was its standard mode of locomotion. The height he estimated at between 6 and 6.5 feet at the top of the head. But the overall impression of the build, he wrote, was of something significantly larger in mass than that height would suggest for a human being. The limbs were proportioned differently. The arms, particularly, he described as longer relative to the torso than human anatomy produces. The head was large. Not dramatically so, but notably so. And the profile he observed as it moved through his headlights for those 2 seconds was not human. It was canine. Not in the way that a metaphor is canine, literally. The snout, the ear shape, the overall cranial structure were those of a large canid. But the body, the posture, the movement, those were bipedal primate. The combination, Officer D wrote, was something his brain spent approximately 10 seconds refusing to process after the creature had disappeared into the brush. He sat in his vehicle on that gravel road for a long time before he continued his patrol. He documented his observations in the voice recorder he kept in his vehicle, a habit he had developed after an earlier unusual wildlife encounter, which we will come back to. And he drove to the point where the creature had entered the brush on the left side of the road. He did not exit the vehicle. He shone his spotlight into the brush. He could see approximately 20 feet into the tree line. Nothing was visible. He continued his patrol. He returned to the station at 3:15 a.m. and completed his standard patrol log. The log noted wildlife activity, a standard notation that covers everything from deer to bear, and nothing more. The next morning, Officer D returned to the crossing point in daylight. He was looking for tracks. The shoulder of the gravel road had soft clay in several sections that would have recorded any significant footfall clearly. On the right shoulder, where the creature had emerged from the brush, he found the following: a series of impressions in the clay consistent with a large bipedal animal. The impressions were not full tracks in the way that a footprint in mud is a full track. The clay was firm enough that only the deepest points of each stride had produced a clear impression. But the stride length was measurable. Officer D measured it. The distance between impressions on the right shoulder, representing the stride of the creature before it reached the road, was approximately 5 feet and 8 inches. He photographed every impression. He measured them with his standard field measuring tape. He photographed the tape next to each impression. He sent the photographs and a written description to Jody Cook the same evening. Cook, in his published documentation of the case, consulted a zoologist at the University of Arkansas, who examined the photographs. The zoologist's written assessment, which Cook published with the zoologist's permission, attributed only to a zoologist at the University of Arkansas at the zoologist's request, stated the following: "The stride length documented in the photographs is consistent with a large bipedal animal of significant height and mass. The impression depth relative to the stride length suggests an animal heavier than the stride length alone would indicate. The impression morphology is inconsistent with any known North American quadruped walking bipedally. It is also inconsistent with any known North American biped, human or otherwise. I cannot identify the animal that produced these impressions from the available evidence. I recommend physical analysis of the clay impressions if they have been preserved. They had not been preserved. A rain event 2 days after Officer D's return visit had erased the impressions from the clay. He had the photographs. The photographs exist. They are in Cook's published documentation. They have been reviewed by multiple researchers. The zoologist's assessment has not been challenged by any subsequent analysis. What produced those impressions has not been identified. Officer D, in his written statement to Cook, added one additional element that he described as something he had debated, including because of how it would sound. He included it anyway. He said that during the 2 seconds that the creature was in his headlights, it turned its head toward him, not its body. Its body continued moving in the direction of travel without interruption. Only its head rotated toward his headlights, toward him, in a way that he described as smooth and controlled and wrong, in a way he could not specify more precisely than that. He said the eyes, caught in his headlights for approximately half a second, reflected light. Not the way deer eyes reflect headlights. The flat, bright retroreflection of tapetum lucidum in a prey animal. Differently, he described the reflection as yellow, self-luminous yellow, like the eyes were generating their own light rather than reflecting his. He said that in the half-second that the eyes were visible, he had the absolute and immediate certainty that whatever he was looking at had been aware of his vehicle's approach before it entered his headlights, that it had known he was there, and had crossed the road anyway. He did not say why he thought it had crossed the road anyway. He said he didn't know. He said that not knowing was what made it difficult to stop thinking about. 3 cases. 3 rangers with combined experience of over 30 years in some of the most remote terrain in the United States. A 14-year NPS veteran in the Grand Canyon who heard something that made language sound wrong, and whose report was classified and denied in full. An 11-year Olympic forest ranger who heard footsteps circle his cabin for 47 minutes and found no tracks in the saturated soil the following morning. An 11-year Ouachita ranger who watched something bipedal cross a forest road in his headlights, measured the stride impressions the following day, and had those impressions assessed by a university zoologist who could not identify the animal that made them. 3 accounts, 3 professionals, 3 locations separated by thousands of miles, and 3 incidents that the official record of the National Park Service describes, to the extent that it describes them at all, as either routine or equipment malfunction. What comes next is harder, not because the accounts are more dramatic, though some of them are, but because the pattern that emerges when you lay these 10 cases side by side is a pattern that none of the individual accounts, taken alone, would produce. And patterns, in the specific kind of research we do on this channel, are always the most significant element. Pay attention to the pattern. The 4th case is different from the first 3 in one significant way. It does not involve a single ranger. It involves 4 of them. 4 rangers working different shifts in different sections of Glacier National Park in Montana over the course of a single summer, the summer of 2003. 4 people who had no documented contact with each other outside of standard operational coordination. 4 people who reported independently the same phenomenon in the same general area of the park. And 4 people who, when the phenomenon was eventually discussed during a routine briefing meeting in late September of that year, discovered for the first time that the others had experienced it too. Glacier National Park sits on the U.S.-Canada border in northwestern Montana. It is one of the most ecologically significant parks in the country. Over 1 million acres of glacially carved mountain terrain, with biodiversity levels that scientists have described as among the highest of any temperate ecosystem on Earth. It is also, in the specific sections relevant to tonight's account, one of the more genuinely remote parks in the lower 48. The area of the park, known as the North Fork Corridor, the section running along the North Fork of the Flathead River on the western boundary, is accessed by a single dirt road that is unpaved, frequently washed out, and navigable only by high-clearance vehicles. The communities in the North Fork Corridor, a handful of private inn holdings and summer cabins, have no cell service and are served by no public utility infrastructure. Power lines do not run into the North Fork. Residents use generators and propane. The forest in that area is the kind of dense, mature conifer forest that existed before European settlement across much of the inland Northwest. A forest that has been largely undisturbed for centuries, and that produces, in the words of a ranger who worked that corridor for 12 years, a quality of silence at night that is different from anywhere else he had ever been. Not peaceful. Dense. Like the silence itself has weight, the 4 rangers at the center of this case all worked sections of the North Fork Corridor during the summer of 2003. Their names, as they appear in the research documentation we worked from, compiled by a journalist named Sarah Chen, who spent 3 years investigating anomalous NPS accounts and who shared her unpublished research with us, are given only as their first initials: Ranger A, Ranger B, Ranger C, and Ranger D. Ranger A was the first to experience it. She was on a solo foot patrol in a section of the North Fork Corridor, approximately 8 miles from the nearest road access, on a clear night in late June, when she became aware of a sound she had never heard in the 9 years she had worked Glacier. She described it to Chen as a vocalization, but one that did not correspond to any animal she knew. Not a bear vocalization, which she knew well. Not any of the canine vocalizations, wolf, coyote, fox, that were common in that area. Not an elk or moose or deer call, not a bird, not any combination of those things that she could construct an explanation from. She described the sound as low, below the range where most wildlife vocalizations operate, and rhythmic, regular, approximately every 40 seconds, coming from a fixed location approximately 200 yards to her east, in dense timber that she could not penetrate visually even with her spotlight. She stood and listened for approximately 20 minutes. The vocalization continued at its regular interval throughout. At no point did it approach. At no point did it stop. She eventually completed her patrol route and left the area. The vocalization was still continuing when she moved out of auditory range. She documented the experience in a personal journal entry, but did not include it in her official patrol log. She did not report it to her supervisor. She described her reasoning to Chen. "I had nothing to say. I heard a sound I couldn't identify. That's not unusual in the backcountry. What was unusual was the specific quality of it. But I had no way to describe that quality on a form. So I wrote it in my journal and I kept working. Ranger B encountered the same phenomenon approximately 3 weeks later, in a different section of the North Fork corridor, approximately 4 miles from where Ranger A had been. His account, given to Chen in a recorded interview, described the same essential characteristics. A low, rhythmic vocalization, regular interval of approximately 40 seconds, fixed location in dense timber, no approach, no variation in volume or cadence over the period of observation. Ranger B observed it for approximately 35 minutes before continuing his patrol. He also did not report it officially. He also described his reasoning in the same terms as Ranger A. Nothing to report. A sound he couldn't identify. Not a threat. Not an emergency. Nothing that had a box on the form. Ranger C encountered it in early August, again in a different section of the same corridor, approximately 6 miles from either of the previous 2 locations. Her account to Chen was the most detailed of the 4, because by the time she spoke to Chen, she had already learned that the others had experienced the same thing, and she had been thinking about it carefully for a long time. She described the same vocalization, the same interval, the same fixed location in dense timber. But she added something that the other 3 had not mentioned. Something she said she had not included in her original account to the group because she wasn't sure how it would sound. She said that at one point during her observation period, which lasted approximately 45 minutes, the interval between vocalizations changed. For a period of approximately 8 minutes, the calls came at shorter intervals, closer to every 20 seconds rather than every 40. Then they returned to the original interval. She described the 8-minute period of shorter intervals as corresponding exactly to the period during which she had been actively moving her spotlight across the timber in an attempt to locate the source. As soon as she stopped moving the spotlight and stood still, the interval returned to 40 seconds. She said she repeated this experiment 3 times during her observation period. Each time she moved the spotlight, the interval shortened. Each time she stood still, it returned to 40 seconds. It was responding to me, she told Chen. Not moving toward me, not moving away from me. Responding. Adjusting its behavior based on what I was doing. I have spent 11 years in wildlife work, and I have never observed that specific behavioral dynamic in any animal I have studied. Animals respond to threat, to potential prey, to competitors, to mates. They do not adjust their vocalization interval in response to the direction of a spotlight beam. Whatever I was listening to was aware of me in a way that was qualitatively different from how wildlife is usually aware of a human observer. Ranger D encountered the phenomenon in late August, in a section of the corridor closest to the park's western boundary, approximately 2 miles from the Canadian border. His account was the briefest of the 4. He described the same vocalization, the same interval, the same timber location. But he added one physical detail that none of the others had mentioned, because none of the others had done what he did. He approached the timber. Not all the way in. He stopped at the edge where the open ground of the patrol route met the tree line. But he stood at the tree line and listened at close range for approximately 15 minutes. Then he shone his spotlight directly into the timber, at the estimated source of the vocalization. The vocalization stopped immediately. He stood at the tree line for approximately 10 more minutes. The vocalization did not resume while he was at the tree line. When he stepped back onto the open ground and began walking away, The vocalization resumed after approximately 2 minutes at its original interval. In the morning, he checked the ground at the tree line where the vocalization had appeared to originate. He found, in the soft soil at the base of several large conifer trunks, a series of depressions, not track-shaped, circular, approximately 8 inches in diameter each, spaced irregularly between 2 and 4 feet apart, as if something had been standing in that spot for an extended period, shifting its weight. He photographed them. He measured them. He sent the photographs to Sarah Chen 3 years later, when she was researching her account of the case. Chen, in her unpublished manuscript, describes them as unlike any impression I have been able to match to a known animal species, in terms of shape, size, or spacing. The 4 rangers discovered in the September briefing meeting that they had all experienced the same phenomenon in the same general corridor over the same summer. None of them had reported it officially. All 4 described the same reasoning. Nothing to report, no category for it, no way to put it on the form. What happened in the briefing meeting when they compared notes? The moment when Ranger C described the spotlight response and Ranger D described the depressions and Ranger B and Ranger A recognized every detail. Sarah Chen describes in her manuscript as the most significant moment of her 3 years of research. She writes, "These are 4 people who have spent a combined 40-plus years in wildlife management in one of the most demanding field environments in the country. They are not given to dramatic interpretation. They are given to documentation and precision." And in that briefing room, comparing notes on an experience they had each carried alone for months, they were, there is no other word for it, frightened. Not by what they had heard, by the implication of what Ranger C had described, that something had been listening to them listening to it, for an entire summer, in the same corridor, knowing they were there, and choosing, for reasons of its own, not to approach. None of the 4 filed a formal report. Sarah Chen's manuscript has not been published. The North Fork corridor is still open to the public. People hike it every summer. The rangers who work it now were not told what was heard in that corridor in 2003. They may be hearing it themselves. They may be writing it in their personal journals and not on the form, because there is still no box on the form for it. The 5th case is the one that, more than any other on tonight's list, demonstrates what happens when rangers start comparing notes. Not in a planned, organized way, not through any official channel, but organically, the way that things get discussed in break rooms and during equipment checks and on the drive back from a long patrol, when the professional distance of the job temporarily gives way to the need to tell someone what you saw. The Yosemite backcountry is one of the most visited wilderness areas in the United States. Yosemite National Park receives over 4 million visitors per year, the vast majority of whom experience the park through the valley. The famous 7-square-mile glacially carved valley floor with its waterfalls and granite walls. But the park covers nearly 750,000 acres total. Most of those acres are designated wilderness, accessible only on foot, with no roads, no facilities, and no regular human presence except for the backcountry rangers who patrol the trails and monitor the ecosystem. The Backcountry Division at Yosemite employs a rotating staff of rangers who conduct solo and paired patrols through the park's wilderness sections throughout the hiking season, typically late May through October. They are among the most experienced field rangers in the NPS system. The people who do backcountry patrol work at Yosemite are not junior rangers finding their feet. They are seasoned professionals who have been selected for assignments that require a high degree of independent judgment and operational capability. The cluster of accounts relevant to tonight's case spans 3 consecutive seasons: 2009, 2010, and 2011. It involves 3 rangers. We will call them Ranger E, Ranger F, and Ranger G, who worked overlapping sections of the park's northern backcountry during that period. The northern backcountry of Yosemite, the section above the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne, running toward the park's northern boundary with the Toyabe National Forest, is the least visited section of the park. Trail use data from the NPS shows that some sections of the northern backcountry receive fewer than 200 visitor days per year. These are trails that experienced Yosemite backcountry users know about, but that the general visiting public never reaches. The rangers who patrol these sections are often the only human beings who move through them for weeks at a time. In the summer of 2009, Ranger E, who had been with Yosemite's backcountry division for 7 years at that point, noticed something during a routine patrol of a trail section in the northern backcountry that she described, in an account shared with us through a researcher who had spent years collecting Yosemite Ranger testimony, as so unremarkable at the time that she almost didn't note it. At a specific location on the trail, a flat, relatively exposed section of granite bench with sparse vegetation and wide sight lines in multiple directions, she found a series of markings on the rock surface. Not the kind of human marking that rangers document and report. No carved initials, no paint, no chalk. Organic markings, scrapes and scratches in the lichen that covered the rock, in a pattern that she did not immediately recognize as significant. She photographed them as part of her standard documentation process and moved on. She found similar markings at the same location the following week, and the week after that. The markings were not identical each time. They varied in their specific configuration, but they were consistently present at that specific location, on that specific section of rock, in a way that was inconsistent with natural lichen degradation or the kind of random animal scratching that produces surface marks on exposed rock. She noted them in her patrol log as recurring organic surface markings, possible wildlife activity, monitoring ongoing. She did not escalate the observation. In the summer of 2010, Ranger F, who had been with the Backcountry Division for 4 years, was assigned an overlapping section of the northern backcountry that included the location where Ranger E had been documenting the markings. Ranger F did not know about Ranger E's documentation. The 2 rangers worked different shifts, and their patrol routes overlapped in the planning stage, but rarely in practice. In the 3rd week of his 2010 assignment, Ranger F found the markings at the same location. He photographed them. He noted them in his patrol log with almost identical language to Ranger E's notation the previous year. Recurring organic surface markings, possible wildlife activity. He also did not escalate. What he did do, and this is the element that ultimately connected the 3 accounts, was notice during one of his evening patrols through that section that the markings had been made recently, within the previous few hours. The lichen debris from the fresh scraping was still present on the rock surface. He was on the trail at approximately 6 p.m. in full daylight, in an area with wide sight lines. There was nothing visible in any direction that could have produced the markings in the time since his previous pass through the same location 4 hours earlier. He sat on the rock bench for approximately 90 minutes, watching. Nothing came, but the markings were there, fresh, made between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., in an area with excellent visibility, by something he had not seen. In the summer of 2011, Ranger G, 13 years with the Backcountry Division, the most senior of the three, was assigned the same section. He found the markings in his first week. He had seen similar markings before, at a different location in the park 7 years earlier. He had not reported them then. He had photographed them, noted them, and moved on, filing the observation under the general category of unexplained wildlife activity that exists in the Backcountry Patrol documentation as a catch-all for things that don't fit more specific categories. Finding the markings again in a different location 7 years later prompted him to do something the other two had not done. He started asking around. Not officially, not through any formal channel. During the end-of-season gear check in October 2011, he mentioned the markings in conversation to Ranger F, who was also present. Ranger F recognized the description immediately. He pulled up his 2010 photographs on his phone. The markings in his photographs and the markings in Ranger G's current season photographs were structurally identical. Not the same specific configuration, but the same type, the same scale, the same location on the same section of rock. Ranger F mentioned that Ranger E had noted them in 2009. Ranger E was contacted. She confirmed it and shared her 2009 photographs. 3 rangers, 3 consecutive years, the same markings, the same location. None of them had known about the other's documentation until that October conversation. What the markings actually are has not been determined. The photographs from all 3 seasons were eventually shared with a wildlife biologist at the University of California, Davis, who examined them at Ranger G's request. The biologist's assessment, communicated verbally to Ranger G and described in the account we received. The markings are not consistent with any wildlife behavior she could identify. They are not consistent with bear marking, which she knew well, and which has a distinctive pattern. They are not consistent with the claw or tooth marks of any other known California wildlife. The scale, the apparent intentionality of the pattern, and here the biologist paused, Ranger G told us, and chose her next words carefully. The apparent intentionality suggested something with manual dexterity. Something that had used something like fingers to produce the marks. Not claws, not a beak. Something more precise. She declined to speculate further. She said she would be happy to examine physical samples if they could be collected, but expressed doubt that they could be collected without disturbing the site in a way that might alter the evidence. No physical samples were ever collected. The markings continued to appear at the same location through the 2012 season, according to Ranger G, and then stopped. He does not know why they stopped. He does not know what produced them. He told us, in the account we received, that the most unsettling part of the 3-year pattern was not the markings themselves, but the consistency of the location. Whatever had been making those markings had been returning to the same specific section of rock, in a 750,000-acre wilderness with thousands of available surfaces, season after season. It had a reason for choosing that particular spot. It had a reason for returning. Ranger G said, "I've spent 13 years in that backcountry. I know what uses a location for a reason and what doesn't. Territorial marking, feeding sites, water sources, den locations. Animals return to places for specific, identifiable reasons. Whatever was returning to that rock was returning for a reason I couldn't identify. And something whose behavior I cannot interpret, operating in terrain I work alone in, is something I think about more than I probably should." The 3 rangers filed no formal report. The markings were noted in 3 seasons of patrol logs under unexplained wildlife activity. The UC Davis biologist was consulted informally, and her assessment was never officially documented. The location in the Yosemite backcountry where the markings appeared is still there. The trail that passes through it is still open. Rangers still patrol it. Whether the markings have resumed since 2012, we do not know. Whether the rangers who work that section now know about the 3-year pattern, we do not know. Whether what produced those markings is still in that section of the northern backcountry, in that 750,000-acre wilderness with its wide granite benches and its sparse vegetation and its sight lines that give you the comforting feeling that you can see everything coming. We do not know either. Before we continue to the next account, if you're enjoying these stories, consider subscribing. It's a great way not to miss what comes next. The 6th case takes us to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, the most visited national park in the United States, with over 12 million visitors per year, and the park that appears more frequently than any other in David Paulides' Missing 401 research. The Smokies have a specific quality that distinguishes them from every other park on tonight's list. They are old mountains, among the oldest on the continent, and the forest that covers them is among the most biologically diverse temperate forest on Earth. More species of trees in a single square mile of the southern Appalachians than in all of northern Europe. A canopy so dense in the hollows and coves that the forest floor exists in a state of perpetual green twilight, and a history of human habitation that stretches back over 10,000 years. A history that was violently interrupted in the 1830s when the Cherokee were forcibly removed from this land, and that left behind, according to anthropologists who have studied the region, a landscape that the Cherokee had named in ways that carried specific warnings about specific locations. Warnings that the National Park Service, when it established the park in 1934, did not consult and did not pass on to the rangers it hired to protect the land. The ranger at the center of the 6th case, we will call her Ranger H, had been with the Great Smoky Mountains Backcountry Division for 8 years when the incident occurred in October 2015. She had worked the night patrol rotation for 5 of those 8 years. She was, by any measure, a highly experienced backcountry ranger in one of the most challenging environments in the eastern United States. She knew the Smokies the way a person knows a house they have lived in for years. Not just the layout, but the sounds, the rhythms, the specific quality of each section of the park at different times of day and night and season. What she found on the night of October 3rd, 2015, during a solo patrol of a backcountry section approximately 14 miles from the nearest trailhead, was something she has described in subsequent accounts as immediately and completely wrong. Not wrong in a way she could have articulated in the moment. Wrong in the way that the brain registers information that doesn't match the expected pattern. A wrongness that manifests as physical discomfort before it resolves into conscious recognition. She was moving along a backcountry trail at approximately 11 p.m. when she detected the smell of wood smoke. This was unusual for 2 reasons. First, the trail section she was patrolling was in a designated wilderness area where no campfires were permitted. Second, the nearest permitted campsite was approximately 4 miles away, in a direction from which the wind was not blowing. She had been in the Smokies long enough to know that wood smoke travels in specific ways in that terrain, and that the concentration of smoke she was detecting was inconsistent with a campfire 4 miles away, even under favorable conditions. She slowed her pace and began moving more carefully, using her spotlight minimally to preserve her night vision, listening as much as navigating. Approximately a quarter mile from where she had first detected the smoke, she found the source. In a small clearing approximately 30 yards off the trail, a clearing that was not marked on any map she had access to, not a designated site, not a known landmark. There was a campfire. Burning. Active. With a flame height she estimated at approximately 12 inches, and a fuel bed of wood that she assessed as having been added to within the past hour. The fire was burning in a stone ring that appeared to have been constructed with some care. Not a casual arrangement of rocks, but a deliberate circle of similarly sized stones, consistently spaced, with the ash and char pattern of a fire that had been used repeatedly over a significant period of time. This was not a new fire ring. Ranger H stood at the edge of the clearing for approximately 10 minutes before approaching. She was scanning for the people who had made the fire. There was nobody visible. No tent, no equipment, no food bags, no backpacks, no clothing, no water bottles, no trash. None of the material culture of camping that she had learned to identify at distance over 8 years of backcountry work. The clearing contained a burning campfire and nothing else. She approached the fire. She checked the perimeter of the clearing, a roughly circular area of approximately 40 feet in diameter. She checked the ground for tracks. She checked the vegetation at the edges of the clearing for signs of disturbance. She checked the trees surrounding the clearing for bear canisters hung in the branches, for tarps, for any evidence of human occupation. She found nothing. The fire was burning in an empty clearing with no evidence of human presence. Not recent evidence. No evidence. The ground around the fire ring, which was soft enough to have recorded footprints clearly, showed no impressions of any kind. The logs in the fire ring, which were burning actively and had clearly been placed there within the past hour, had been placed there without producing any trace of the person or thing that had placed them. Ranger H remained at the clearing for approximately 40 minutes. She documented everything she observed photographically. She did not put the fire out. Her reasoning, which she explained in a subsequent account, was that a burning fire in a wilderness area is a safety concern that should be allowed to burn out under observation rather than being smothered, because smothering can preserve live coals that reignite hours later. So she sat at the edge of the clearing and watched the fire burn. And during those 40 minutes, she became aware of something that she did not include in her official report. She became aware, gradually and then unmistakably, that the clearing was not empty. Not in the sense of seeing anything. Not in the sense of hearing anything. In the sense of perceiving something that she described, in the account she gave to researcher Christopher Balzano, who spent years documenting Smoky Mountains Ranger accounts and who shared his notes with us, as a quality of attention directed at her from the tree line surrounding the clearing. Not threatening, not approaching, attending. She used that word specifically when she spoke to Balzano. Something in the tree line was attending to her presence the way an observer attends to a subject, with focused, sustained, deliberate awareness. She sat with that awareness for 40 minutes while the fire burned down. She did not move toward the tree line. The tree line did not move toward her. When the fire had burned to a safe level of ember, she documented its final state, photographed the stone ring and the surrounding ground one more time, and left the clearing the way she had entered it. She returned to the trail. She completed her patrol. She filed her incident report the following morning. The report described the discovery of an unauthorized campfire in a designated wilderness area, the apparent absence of any campers at the scene, the safe burn down of the fire, and a recommendation that the area be monitored for repeat unauthorized fire activity. It did not describe the stone ring. It did not describe the absence of tracks. It did not describe the quality of attention she had perceived from the tree line. She told Balzano, "There was nothing I could have put in the report that would have been more useful than what I left out. Everything I left out would have produced questions I couldn't answer and raised concerns about my fitness for duty that I wasn't prepared to deal with. So I wrote what I could write and I left the rest in the clearing. The clearing is still there. It is not on any NPS map. The stone ring, Ranger H said in her account, was still present the last time she patrolled that section, 2 years after the 2015 incident. Still there. Stones still in place. The char pattern of repeated fires still visible in the center. Whether there have been fires in it since 2015, she does not know. Whether whoever or whatever built that ring and tended it has returned to it, she does not know. What she knows is that something sat in that tree line for 40 minutes while she was in the clearing, watching, and that when she left, it was still there. The 7th case crosses the border, into Canada, into the boreal forest of northern Manitoba, and into the only account tonight that comes from a government archive rather than from a researcher's fieldwork or a ranger's personal testimony. In 2001, Parks Canada, the Canadian equivalent of the National Park Service, released a series of previously restricted operational documents as part of a routine declassification review. Most of these documents were administrative in nature: budget records, maintenance logs, personnel correspondence. But included in the release, apparently without specific intention, was a field report from the winter of 1989 that had been held at a restricted access level for 12 years without any formal classification designation. It had not been formally classified. It had simply been held back. The reason for the restriction was not noted in the release documentation. The report was filed by a Parks Canada ranger named Harold Desjardins. His full name appears in the document and has since been cited in multiple research contexts, which is why we are using it. Who was assigned to a solo winter patrol of a section of Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba in February of 1989. Riding Mountain is a plateau that rises approximately 1,600 feet above the surrounding Manitoba plains, a forested highland ecosystem in the middle of predominantly agricultural land, the largest protected area in southern Manitoba, covering nearly 200 square miles. In winter, with snow cover and reduced daylight and temperatures that regularly drop below -30 Celsius, it is one of the more demanding patrol environments in the Parks Canada system. Ranger Desjardins had worked winter patrols in Riding Mountain for 7 years, by February 1989. He was experienced, he was physically fit, and he was familiar with every section of the park he was assigned to cover. His February patrol was a standard 5-day solo assignment, using a backcountry cabin as his base. He had used the same cabin on 3 previous winter assignments without incident. The incident, in the language of the declassified report, occurred on the 3rd day of the assignment. Desjardins was skiing along a patrol route that followed an established trail through a section of dense boreal forest, predominantly black spruce and tamarack, with a closed canopy that reduced snowfall on the trail to a thin layer, making travel reasonably efficient in the conditions. At approximately 2 p.m., still daylight, though the light quality in a closed canopy boreal forest in February Manitoba is the dim, flat light of heavy overcast even at midday. He encountered something on the trail that brought him to a complete stop. The trail, which he had skied dozens of times over 7 years of assignments, was blocked. Not by a fallen tree, not by a snowdrift, not by any natural obstruction that winter conditions in that forest could plausibly produce. It was blocked by what Desjardins described in his report, and the language here is precise, official, and clearly chosen with care, as a condition of passage that made forward movement on the trail feel physically impossible. Not that it was physically impossible, that it felt physically impossible. He wrote, "I attempted to continue along the trail and found that I could not. Not because of any visible obstruction, not because of any terrain feature, because something about the specific section of trail ahead of me produced a physical sensation of resistance that I was unable to override through effort of will. I stood at the point of resistance for approximately 15 minutes. I attempted to advance on 4 separate occasions. Each attempt produced the same result, an immediate and overwhelming physical sensation that stopping was the correct response and that continuing would be a serious mistake. I have spent 7 winters in this forest. I know what this trail looks like and what it feels like to move along it. What I experienced at that location was not related to any environmental feature I could identify. I turned around and returned to the cabin." The report then contains a detail that is, in the context of a formal Parks Canada operational document, remarkable. Desjardins wrote, "I am aware that this report describes an experience that does not have a standard operational category. I have considered whether to submit it and have decided that it should be on record because I believe the location should be monitored. Something is operating in that section of the trail that I cannot identify, and that I am not willing to attempt to pass through without a clearer understanding of what it is. I recommend that other patrol staff be briefed about the location before being assigned to routes that include it." The recommendation was not acted on. The report was held at restricted access for 12 years. When it was released in 2001, a researcher named Patricia Marchand, a Canadian anthropologist who had been studying indigenous oral traditions of the Anishinaabe people of southern Manitoba, obtained it through the declassification release and recognized something significant about the location Desjardins had described. The trail section, where he had encountered the physical sensation of resistance, corresponded precisely to an area that the local Anishinaabe community had identified, in oral tradition documented by Marchand over years of fieldwork, as a location where the boundary between the physical world and what their tradition described as the adjacent world was dangerously thin. Not a general area, not a broad zone, the specific trail section. Marchand published a paper in 2003 noting the correspondence between the Desjardins report and the Anishinaabe oral tradition. The paper was published in a Canadian anthropology journal with a limited circulation and received no mainstream attention. We obtained it through the journal's archive. Marchand described the correspondence as one of the most striking examples of independent convergence between official documentation and indigenous traditional knowledge I have encountered in 20 years of fieldwork. The section of trail that Harold Desjardins could not bring himself to pass through in February 1989 is still there. It is still part of the patrol route. Whether any subsequent ranger has experienced what Desjardins experienced at that location, we do not know. His recommendation that patrol staff be briefed was not acted on. Whether any subsequent ranger has known to report it if they had, we do not know either. Harold Desjardins retired from Parks Canada in 1997. We were unable to reach him for comment. Patricia Marchand is still active in her research. She declined our request for an interview through her university's communications office without explanation. The 8th case comes from a forest that we have covered before on this channel. the Shawnee National Forest in the southern tip of Illinois. We mentioned the Shawnee in our video on the 5 forests where people consistently report the same presence, specifically in connection with the Garden of the Gods, a section of eroded sandstone formations that local Native American traditions describe as a meeting point between worlds, and where multiple independent witnesses have reported hearing voices speaking in an unidentifiable language coming from inside the rock formations. The ranger account we are covering tonight comes from that same section of the Shawnee. It is different from those earlier accounts in one significant way. This time, the voice was recorded. The ranger, we will call him Ranger Hine, which is the designation used in the research documentation we received from the same researcher, Tobias Wayland of the Singular Fortean Society, who initially documented the case, had been with the Shawnee National Forest Ranger Division for 9 years when his encounter occurred in August of 2017. He had worked the Garden of the Gods section regularly over those 9 years. He was familiar with the terrain, the rock formations, the sound qualities of the area, which are unusual because the sandstone formations create natural resonance chambers that modify ambient sound in ways that can be disorienting to visitors unfamiliar with the area. He had heard visitors mistake this acoustic phenomenon for voices on multiple occasions, and had learned to distinguish the natural resonance effects from actual vocalization. What he heard on the night of August 11, 2017, was not the natural resonance effect. He was on a solo night patrol, a routine check of the Garden of the Gods area, which received enough visitor traffic to warrant regular after-hours monitoring for unauthorized camping and fire activity, when he became aware of a sound coming from the interior of a specific sandstone formation known informally among the ranger staff as the Cathedral Rock. Cathedral Rock is one of the larger formations in the Garden of the Gods section, approximately 40 feet tall, with a series of internal chambers and passages that are accessible but require careful navigation in daylight and are essentially impenetrable in the dark. The sound ranger I heard coming from Cathedral Rock was described by him in his account to Wayland in the following terms. It was structured. It had the rhythm and cadence of speech, of language. It was not random acoustic noise. It was not wind. It was not the normal resonance behavior of the rock. It had the specific quality of intentional communication, the quality that the human auditory system is specifically calibrated to detect, because detecting intentional communication from other beings is one of the most evolutionarily critical functions of human hearing. He described the sensation of hearing it as immediate and physical, not an intellectual assessment that what he was hearing sounded like language, but a visceral, automatic recognition that something was communicating. What language it was communicating in, he could not identify. It was not English. It was not Spanish, which he spoke conversationally. It was not French, which he had studied in college. It was not like any language he had heard, but it was, unambiguously and inescapably, language. Ranger I had his voice recorder with him, a habit he had developed, like several other rangers on tonight's list, after a previous unusual experience that had taught him the value of audio documentation. He activated the recorder and held it toward the formation for approximately 12 minutes, while the vocalization continued. Then he approached the formation. He moved to within approximately 10 feet of the nearest opening into the interior passages. The vocalization continued. He spoke. He said at normal conversational volume, directed toward the formation. "Hello?" The vocalization stopped immediately. He stood at the opening for approximately 15 minutes. The vocalization did not resume. He completed his patrol and returned to the ranger station. He reviewed the audio recording the following morning. The recording contained the ambient sounds of the Garden of the Gods at night. Insects, wind, his own footsteps. It contained his own voice saying, "Hello." It did not contain the vocalization. 12 minutes of audio recorded, while a vocalization that Ranger I could clearly hear was emanating from a rock formation 10 to 30 feet away. And the recording contained nothing. Not reduced volume. Not background noise at the relevant frequency. Nothing. Ranger. I brought the recording to a colleague, Ranger J, who had worked the same section of the Shawnee for 6 years, and who is the second witness relevant to this account. He played the recording and described what he had heard. Ranger J listened to the recording. Then Ranger J said something that Ranger I has described as the most significant moment of the entire experience. Ranger J said, "I know." He said, "I've heard it too, 3 times in the past 2 years, and my recorder never captures it either." Ranger J had not mentioned his own experiences to anyone. Ranger I had not mentioned his. They were the first conversation they had ever had about it. 2 rangers working the same section of the same forest, hearing the same thing from the same formation on separate occasions over multiple years, and neither of them had told anyone. Ranger. I asked Ranger J why he had never reported it. Ranger J said, "Because I checked. The last time I heard it, I went back in daylight with a biologist and we checked every inch of those passages. There's nothing in there. No animal that could produce that sound. No acoustic feature that could produce structured vocalization. Nothing. If I filed a report saying I heard something that a biologist confirmed doesn't exist, the only outcome is that someone questions my fitness for the assignment. I'm not willing to do that." The Singular Fortean Society published Wayland's documentation of the case in 2019. The publication included the audio recording, which, as described, contains no vocalization. The account has been reviewed by multiple researchers since publication. No one has offered a conventional explanation for what Ranger Wine and Ranger J both heard, both recorded, and both failed to capture on their recordings. The Garden of the Gods section of the Shawnee National Forest is still open to the public. Cathedral Rock is still there. The passages through it are still accessible to visitors during daylight hours. Whether the vocalization is still occurring, we do not know. What we know is that 2 rangers heard it independently over a period of at least 3 years, that their audio equipment consistently failed to capture it, and that the biologist who checked the formation in daylight found nothing inside it that could account for it. The Anishinaabe and the Shawnee people who knew this land before the National Forest existed described the Garden of the Gods as a meeting point, not a metaphor for natural beauty. A literal meeting point between the world of the living and something else. Whatever Ranger I and Ranger J heard in that formation in 2017 and in 2015 and 2016 was meeting something. Whether that something was them, neither of them has been willing to say. The 9th case returns us to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. The same densely forested, GPS unreliable, radio inconsistent wilderness that produced the 2nd case on tonight's list, the Ranger Station 7 account from 1997. The Olympic Peninsula appears more frequently than any other geographic location in the accounts we have collected over the past year of research for this video. That frequency is not random. The Olympic National Forest has one of the highest per visitor disappearance rates of any protected wilderness area in the United States. David Paulides has documented multiple missing 411 cases from the Olympic Peninsula with characteristics: no tracks, dogs losing scent abruptly, bodies found in areas already searched, impossibly displaced victims, that place them in the anomalous category of his research. The Ho and Quileute peoples, whose ancestral territory encompasses the Olympic Peninsula, have oral traditions about specific locations in that forest that have been documented by anthropologists as describing not a general spiritual quality of the land, but specific, locationally precise warnings about areas where the boundary between the physical world and what their tradition describes as the adjacent world is dangerously unstable. The ranger at the center of the 9th case, we will call him Ranger K, had worked the Olympic National Forest for 12 years when the incident occurred in September 2019. He had patrolled sections of the Ho River Valley, the Quinault Rainforest, and the backcountry trails of the Olympic interior. He had been involved in multiple search and rescue operations in the forest, including 3 that he described in the account he gave to a researcher connected to our network, as producing evidence inconsistent with the official conclusions. He was, in short, a ranger with a long enough history in that specific forest to know what it contained and what it didn't. On the night of September 17, 2019, Ranger K was conducting a solo patrol of a section of the Ho River Valley backcountry, a section that included a stretch of trail that had been flagged in the patrol rotation notes, with no further explanation, as requiring additional monitoring. He had asked his supervisor about the flag. His supervisor had said only that it was a standing note from several years back, and that he should monitor for unauthorized camping and fire activity. No further context was provided. Ranger K had not patrolled that specific stretch before. He entered the section at approximately 9 p.m. with full backcountry equipment: headlamp, GPS, radio, sidearm, first aid kit, emergency bivouac gear. He was moving at a standard patrol pace, documenting trail conditions, when his GPS began behaving anomalously at approximately 10:15 p.m. Not failing entirely, still producing a position reading, but the position it was reading placed him on a trail that, when he checked his topo maps, did not exist. The topo maps he carried were the most current available NPS backcountry maps for that section of the Olympic National Forest. The trail he was physically standing on, the trail he had been walking for over an hour, the trail that was clearly maintained with a defined tread and cleared vegetation on either side, was not on those maps. He stopped. He checked his GPS against his maps multiple times. The discrepancy was consistent. According to his maps, he was standing in the middle of a section of undifferentiated forest with no trail. According to his GPS, he was on a trail that was not charted. According to his own physical experience, he was standing on a clearly defined, apparently maintained trail that had been easy and straightforward to walk. He had not made a navigation error. He had not taken an unmarked spur by mistake. He had been on a known, mapped trail when the GPS anomaly began, and had not deviated from the tread. He stood at that point for approximately 20 minutes, checking his position, checking his maps, checking his compass, which was reading correctly, consistent with his known heading. The trail was real. The GPS position appeared correct relative to landmarks he could identify. The trail simply was not on any map. At approximately 10:40 p.m., Ranger K became aware of something ahead of him on the trail. At a distance he estimated at approximately 60 to 80 yards, in the limit of his headlamp's effective range, something was standing on the trail, standing completely still, facing him. He stopped. he increased his headlamp to maximum brightness. At that distance, with maximum headlamp, he could resolve a shape but not details. What he could determine, it was bipedal, upright, in the center of the trail. Approximately human in overall silhouette, but with proportions that he described as wrong, in a way he could not precisely specify. The overall impression of the shape was human, but the specific ratios of the body were not. He stood and looked at it for approximately 4 minutes. It did not move. He called out, the standard ranger protocol for announcing presence to a potential person on the trail. No response. He called out a second time. No response. He took 3 steps forward. The shape stepped backward, not turning and walking away, but stepping backward, maintaining its facing toward him, retreating from his approach while keeping its front oriented toward him. He stopped. It stopped. He took 3 more steps forward. It stepped backward again. The same dynamic, advance, retreat, maintaining facing. He repeated this 3 more times. Each time, the shape stepped back the exact number of steps he advanced, maintaining a consistent distance of approximately 60 to 80 yards between them. On his 5th advance, the shape did not step back. It was simply gone. Not moving away into the trees. Gone in the way that the Grand Canyon Ranger's body camera anomaly was gone, in the way that the footsteps outside Ranger Station 7 were gone. Present and then not present, with no intermediate transition. Ranger K stood on the trail for a long time after that. He described the period of standing as one in which he made a number of decisions. He decided not to advance further along the trail. He decided to return to his entry point and reorient using landmarks rather than GPS. He decided not to call his supervisor on the radio. He decided not to file a formal report of the encounter when he returned to the ranger station. He made all of these decisions, he said, with complete awareness that they were departures from standard protocol. He made them anyway. He returned to his entry point, verified his position against known landmarks, and completed the remaining portion of his patrol by a different route. His GPS resumed normal, map-consistent behavior approximately 30 minutes after he turned around. He filed a standard patrol log noting trail conditions and no notable incidents. He did include one notation that he described, in his account to our researcher, as the only thing he was willing to put on the record. He flagged the section of trail for follow-up mapping review, noting a possible discrepancy between GPS track data and current topo maps. The flag is still in the patrol rotation notes. It has not been followed up on. The trail that Ranger K walked for over an hour in the Olympic National Forest in September 2019 is either not on any current NPS map or it does not exist in the way that trails normally exist. He does not know which. He told our researcher, "I've been in that forest for 12 years. I know what a trail looks like. I know the difference between a maintained trail and a game trail, and a dry drainage, and a section of undifferentiated forest floor." What I was walking on was a trail, a real, maintained, intentional trail that has no record of ever being built, and something was using it, something that knew exactly how far to stay ahead of me, something that had been there long enough to know the trail that nobody else knows exists. The Ho and Quileute oral traditions, which Ranger K researched after the incident, describe the adjacent world as a place that occupies the same physical space as the material world, but is oriented differently, accessible at specific locations where the two orientations briefly align. They describe trails in the adjacent world, trails that run parallel to the trails of the material world but do not appear on the same maps. They describe entities that use those trails, entities that are aware of travelers on the material trails running parallel to theirs, and that are sometimes seen, briefly at the limit of visibility, before the alignment shifts and the adjacent trail is no longer accessible to material perception. Ranger K was not familiar with this tradition before his encounter. When he read it afterward, he said, "It was the first time since September 17, 2019, that something had provided a framework, however incomplete, however culturally specific, however impossible to verify, for what he had experienced on an unmapped trail in the Hoh River Valley in the dark. The 10th and final case on tonight's list is different from every other account we have covered. It is different in the most significant way possible. The ranger at the center of this case filed a full report. She documented everything she encountered in detail using her own name in an official incident report submitted through standard NPS channels. She did not minimize. She did not omit. She did not translate what she had experienced into language that fit the available forms. She wrote what happened, and then she waited to see what would happen next. Ranger L, and we are using this designation not because she asked for anonymity, but because we have agreed not to identify her until she has decided how much public attention she is prepared to receive, had been with the Appalachian Trail Management Unit of the National Park Service for 9 years when the incident occurred in October 2022. The Appalachian Trail Management Unit is one of the more unusual divisions of the NPS, because the AT is not a single geographically contained park, but a 2,190-mile linear corridor passing through 14 states and managed through a complex partnership between the NPS, the U.S. Forest Service, state agencies, and private landowners. The rangers who work the AT management unit operate across a vast and varied landscape, and they develop, over years of work, a specific kind of expertise. Not the deep familiarity with a single terrain that a Yosemite or Olympic ranger develops, but a broad, adaptive knowledge of how the trail behaves differently in different sections and what each section's specific character requires from the people who work it. Ranger L had worked sections of the AT in Virginia for all 9 of her years with the unit. She knew the Virginia sections well, the high ridge sections of the George Washington National Forest, the rocky terrain of the Shenandoah, the lower, denser sections of the Jefferson National Forest in the southwestern part of the state. Her assignment in October 2022 was a 5-day solo patrol of a section of the Jefferson National Forest AT in a remote area of Giles County that receives relatively low hiker traffic in October and that had been flagged, like the Olympic section in the 9th case, with a standing monitoring note. Unlike Ranger K, Ranger L asked about the monitoring note before she went out. Her supervisor told her it had been in the rotation since 2018, placed there after a different ranger had filed an unusual incident report from that section that year. She asked to see that report. Her supervisor said it had been forwarded to a regional NPS office and was not locally accessible. She went on the patrol without having read it. She would later learn, through a source she describes only as someone within the NPS administrative structure who was willing to share information informally, that the 2018 report from the same section had described phenomena similar to what she encountered in 2022. But she did not know that when she went out. Her encounter occurred on the second night of her assignment. She was at her planned camp location, approximately 11 miles from the nearest road access, when she woke at approximately 1 a.m. to the forest silence that every experienced backcountry worker learns to recognize as a primary indicator of large predator activity in the immediate area. She was in her tent. She lay still and listened. She heard nothing for approximately 3 minutes. Then she heard breathing. Not inside the tent, outside it. Close. On the left side of the tent, approximately 3 to 4 feet from the tent wall. Slow breathing. Deliberate. Not the quick, shallow breathing of a small animal investigating the campsite. Long, slow inhalations and exhalations, with a rhythm she described as more consistent with a large animal at rest than with any animal in active predator mode. She estimated, based on the volume and quality of the sound relative to the tent fabric, that whatever was breathing outside her tent was large, significantly larger than a human. She lay still for approximately 15 minutes. The breathing continued without variation throughout. She made no sound. At the end of those 15 minutes, she made a decision that she described, in the account she filed subsequently, as both the most professionally correct and the most personally frightening decision she made during the patrol. She unzipped her tent, slowly and quietly. She had her headlamp on, set to low. She had her sidearm in her hand. She pushed the tent door open enough to see out. What she saw on the left side of her tent was nothing, not diminished evidence of something having been there, not disturbed ground or vegetation. Nothing. The breathing had been continuous and clearly audible for 15 minutes. It had stopped at the exact moment she unzipped the tent, not gradually, not in the way an animal would move away at the sound of the zipper. It stopped, and the ground next to her tent showed no evidence that anything had been standing there. She exited the tent completely. She examined the perimeter of the campsite. She examined the vegetation. She examined the soft forest floor, which was damp enough to record footfalls. She found nothing. She spent the remainder of that night outside her tent, sitting with her back against a tree, watching the perimeter of the campsite with her headlamp on. Nothing else occurred. In the morning, she broke camp and completed the remaining 3 days of her patrol. When she returned to the ranger station, she filed her incident report. The report was 12 pages long. It contained a full, detailed account of everything she had experienced: the timing, the duration, the quality of the breathing, the absence of physical evidence, the condition of the campsite in the morning. She described it in precise professional language, without speculation about cause or interpretation. She described what she had observed and documented. She noted that the physical evidence was inconsistent with any wildlife encounter she had experience with. She noted that the complete absence of tracks or vegetation disturbance on soft, damp forest floor was, in her professional assessment, anomalous. She noted the standing monitoring flag on that section of trail and recommended that the 2018 report it referenced be reviewed in conjunction with her own report. She submitted it through standard channels. She waited. Her supervisor called her in for a meeting within 24 hours of submission. In that meeting, he told her that her report was well written and professionally presented. He told her that it was being forwarded to the regional office. He told her that, in the meantime, he was recommending that she take a few days of administrative leave and consult with the NPS Employee Assistance Program. He said this was standard procedure when a ranger filed an unusual incident report. She had never heard of this procedure. She spoke with a colleague who had worked the unit for 20 years. The colleague had never heard of it either. She took the administrative leave. She consulted with the Employee Assistance Program as directed. 3 sessions with a contracted counselor who, she said, seemed neither surprised by the content of her report nor informed about its specifics, and who asked questions that she described as generic rather than incident-specific. She returned to duty. She has not been assigned to that section of the trail since. She has not been told whether her report was reviewed at the regional level. She has not been told whether the 2018 report was retrieved and compared with hers. She filed a FOIA request for both reports. The 2022 report, her own report, was returned to her in heavily redacted form. The sections describing the physical evidence were redacted. The sections describing the absence of tracks were redacted. The recommendation to review the 2018 report was redacted. The sections describing the timeline and her professional assessment were left intact. The 2018 report was not included in the FOIA response. Its existence was acknowledged in a cover letter. Its contents were described as not subject to release under FOIA Exemption 7, which covers law enforcement records. The 2018 report from a backcountry section of the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia, describing an encounter that prompted a standing monitoring flag that was still in the patrol rotation 4 years later, is a law enforcement record. Ranger L. received her redacted report and the cover letter acknowledging the existence of the 2018 report in January 2023. She is still with the NPS. She is still working the AT Management Unit. She has not been assigned to that section of the trail again. She told us, "I did what I was trained to do. I observed accurately, and I reported precisely, and I submitted through the correct channels. The correct channels responded by redacting what I had written and sending me to a counselor. I have thought about what that response means every day since. I have not reached a conclusion I'm comfortable with. The breathing was real. Whatever was outside my tent that night was real. The absence of tracks was real. The redactions are real. I can account for 3 of those 4 things. I cannot account for why the 4th one happened, and that is what I think about. 10 cases, 10 rangers, a combined professional experience of over 100 years in the field. Grand Canyon, Olympic National Forest, Ouachita National Forest, Glacier National Park, Yosemite Backcountry, Great Smoky Mountains, Riding Mountain in Manitoba, Shawnee National Forest, the Olympic Peninsula again, and the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. 10 locations separated by thousands of miles. 10 accounts from people with the training and experience to know the difference between what belongs in a wilderness environment and what doesn't. And 10 instances in which something was present in that environment that those people, with all of their combined experience, all of their equipment, all of their professional frameworks for observation and documentation, could not identify, explain, or file correctly. The pattern, when you lay all 10 accounts side by side, is this. The things that were present did not behave like wildlife. They were aware of the rangers in a way that wildlife is not aware of observers. Not the reactive awareness of a prey animal detecting a predator. Not the territorial awareness of a predator monitoring competition, but a deliberate, focused, sustained awareness of a specific human individual in a specific location. The kind of awareness that implies intention. The things that were present produced no physical trace, or produced trace that did not correspond to any known animal. The footsteps outside Ranger Station 7 that left no impressions in saturated soil. The lichen markings in Yosemite that a biologist attributed to something with manual dexterity. The campfire in the Smoky Mountains clearing surrounded by ground that showed no footfall. The breathing outside Ranger L's tent in Virginia on damp forest floor that left nothing. The trail in the Olympic backcountry that appears on no map but is clearly maintained. The things that were present responded to being observed. The glacier vocalizations that shortened their interval when the spotlight moved. The shape on the Olympic trail that retreated at exactly the pace of advance. The Shawnee voices that stopped the moment they were acknowledged. The Grand Canyon audio that cut out at the moment the ranger said there was something wrong with the sound. And the things that were present, in almost every case, made the rangers who encountered them decide not to put the full account in the official report. Not because they doubted what they had experienced, because there was no box on the form, because the system that was supposed to receive their observations had no category for what they were observing. And when one ranger, Ranger L in Virginia in 2022, did put the full account in the official report, the system responded by redacting the physical evidence sections and classifying the corroborating report under a law enforcement exemption. These forests are still open. The trails in them are still mapped, most of them. The rangers who work them now were not told about these 10 cases. They are going out tonight, alone, in the dark, in terrain where radio coverage is inconsistent and backup is an hour away. And whatever was in those forests when these 10 rangers encountered it, whatever is aware, whatever leaves no trace, whatever adjusts its behavior in response to being observed, whatever the FOIA exemption is protecting, is still out there, in forests that are still open, on trails that 3 million people walk every year. Most of them never see it. Most of them. If you enjoy supernatural stories, consider subscribing. New stories are published regularly. If you work in the Forest Service, the National Park Service, or any land management agency, and you have encountered something on patrol that you did not put in the official report because there was no box for it, we want to hear from you. Specifically, location, what you encountered, what you documented, and what you didn't, and why. We treat everything submitted to us as confidential unless you specify otherwise. We have been building a record for over a year. The 10 cases tonight are not the full extent of what we have collected. They are the ones we were able to document to a standard we were confident in. There are others. And based on the pattern those 10 cases reveal, we believe there are many more that have never been shared with anyone. The comment section is below. If you've been carrying something, you don't have to carry it alone.